How to reduce cost in Azure Cloud by 40%. Hi there. Today we'll talk about how to reduce cost in Azure Cloud by 40%. We'll cover everything you need to know about how to reduce cost in Azure Cloud. So, let's get started. Why Azure Cloud costs spiral out of control for SMBs? Most SMBs start on Azure using pay-as-you-go pricing. That's reasonable in the early days. You don't know exactly what you'll need, so you pick resources conservatively and keep everything running. The problem is that most teams never revisit those defaults. Virtual machines run at 15% CPU utilization around the clock. Storage accounts accumulate snapshots nobody ever cleans up. Dev and test environments run on weekends when no one is working. Over 6 to 12 months, these small inefficiencies compound into a bill that's significantly higher than it should be. 3 patterns drive most unnecessary Azure spend. Over-provisioned resources, VMs sized for peak load but running at low average utilization. Idle resources, environments left running outside working hours. Unmanaged data growth, snapshots, old backups, and orphan disks that accumulate silently. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward fixing them. How to reduce cost in Azure Cloud using reserved instances. Azure Reserved Instances, RIs, can save between 40% and 72% compared to pay-as-you-go pricing on the same virtual machine SKUs. That's not a marketing claim. It's published in Microsoft's own documentation on Azure Reserved VM instances. The mechanism is simple. You commit to using a specific VM size in a specific Azure region for either 1 year or 3 years. In exchange, Microsoft gives you a significant discount over the equivalent on-demand rate. You pay for the reservation whether or not the resource is running, so this only makes sense for workloads with predictable, sustained usage. When reserved instances make sense for your business, reserved instances work best for production web servers and API backends running 24/7 databases with consistent query volumes, background processing jobs with reliable schedules, dev servers that your team uses every business day. They don't make sense for burst workloads, seasonal resources, or anything you spin up less than 70% of the time. For those cases, pay-as-you-go or spot instances are the better option. Our detailed breakdown in Reduce Cloud Costs by 40% with Azure Reserved Instances covers how to pick the right reservation scope, manage exchanges, and calculate your actual payback period. If a VM is running more than 70% of the time, a 1-year reservation typically recovers its cost premium within 4 to 5 months. Azure Autoscaling, pay only for what you use. Autoscaling is one of the most effective ways to reduce cost in Azure Cloud for workloads with variable traffic. The idea is straightforward. Azure automatically adds capacity when demand spikes and removes it when demand drops. You stop paying for idle compute. Azure supports autoscaling through several mechanisms. Virtual machine scale sets, VMSS scale sets of identical VMs based on CPU, memory, or custom metrics. Azure App Service Autoscale, for web apps, APIs, and function apps. Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, Cluster Autoscaler, adds or removes nodes based on pod scheduling needs. Autoscaling best practices for small businesses. Getting autoscaling right takes more than just enabling the feature. A few practices make the difference between smooth operation and unpredictable bills. Set both scale out and scale in rules. Many teams only configure scale out, adding capacity, but forget scale in, removing it. Your bill keeps climbing even after the traffic spike ends. Use custom metrics where possible. CPU utilization is a blunt instrument. For a web app, requests per second or queue depth often trigger scaling at a more accurate threshold. Add cooldown periods. Without cooldown windows, Azure can oscillate between scaling up and down rapidly. A 5-minute cooldown after each scaling event prevents this. Test your scale-in behavior. Run load tests against your staging environment to confirm that resources are actually removed after simulated traffic drops. A well-configured autoscaling setup can cut compute costs by 20 to 30% compared to static provisioning. Combined with reserved instances on your baseline capacity, the savings stack quickly. Workload-based resource benchmarking for Azure cost optimization. Most Azure cost guides tell you to right-size your VMs. That's good advice, but it's not specific enough to act on directly. Workload-based resource benchmarking gives you a precise, repeatable framework. The approach has 4 steps. Measure actual resource consumption for each workload over a 30-day period. Azure Monitor and Azure Advisor both provide this data. Look at average CPU, peak CPU, average memory, and network throughput. Classify workloads by utilization tier: high, above 70% average CPU, medium, 40 to 70%, and low, below 40%. Right size based on tier: downsize low utilization VMs to the next smaller SKU. For high utilization VMs, consider whether autoscaling is a better solution than a larger static instance. Repeat quarterly. Usage patterns change as your product evolves and your team grows. A VM sized correctly 6 months ago may already be over or under provisioned. Microsoft's own data indicates that roughly 30% of cloud workloads run on over-provisioned VMs. Right-sizing those workloads typically produces 20 to 30% cost savings with no performance impact. For a structured approach to this process, the Azure Cost Optimization (SMB) Savings Strategies Guide includes a workload classification template you can adapt directly. Azure Cost Management Tools every SMB should use. Knowing how to reduce cost in Azure Cloud is partly about strategy and partly about using the right tools. Azure provides a solid set of native cost management capabilities that most SMBs underuse. Azure Cost Management Plus Billing is the primary tool. It shows real-time spend by resource, resource group, subscription, and tag. You can set budgets and configure alerts when spending crosses a threshold, which prevents the bill shock many teams experience at month-end. Azure Advisor analyzes your environment and generates specific cost recommendations. It flags idle VMs, underused ExpressRoute circuits, and suggests reservation purchases based on your usage history. Each recommendation includes an estimated monthly savings figure, so you can prioritize by impact. Azure Pricing Calculator lets you model costs before you provision resources. This is particularly useful when architecting new features or planning migrations. You can access it at azure.microsoft.com/and-us/pricing/calculator. Azure Monitor provides the utilization data you need for workload benchmarking. Set up dashboards tracking CPU, memory, and disk across your key resources. Without this visibility, right-sizing decisions are guesswork. The Azure Cost Management Plus Billing documentation on Microsoft Learn covers configuration details for all of these tools in depth. For team-specific configuration guidance, the 7 proven Azure Cost Optimization tips for SMBs post covers alert thresholds that work well for teams in the $500,000 to $5 million ARR range. Azure versus AWS, which is actually cheaper for small businesses? The honest answer: it depends on your workload, but Azure often wins for Microsoft-centric businesses. Azure pricing for small businesses carries a significant advantage when existing Microsoft licenses are already in play. Here is a direct comparison for common SMB workloads. Workload Azure Option AWS Equivalent Azure Advantage Windows Server VM Azure VM with included license EC2 plus separate Windows license 20 to 30% cheaper via Azure Hybrid Benefits SQL Database Azure SQL Managed Instance RDS SQL Server Significant savings with BYOL Identity Management Azure Active Directory, Entra ID, AWS IAM plus Cognito included in Microsoft 365 Dev/Test Environments Azure Dev/Test Pricing, up to 55% off. No equivalent program clear Azure Advantage. Azure's biggest cost advantage for SMBs comes from 2 sources. First, the Azure Hybrid Benefit lets you bring existing Windows Server and SQL Server licenses to Azure, saving up to 40% compared to running the same workloads on AWS without those licenses. Second, Azure's integration with Microsoft 365 means many SMBs are already paying for tools, Azure AD, Intune, Defender, that would cost extra on AWS. That said, if your stack is primarily open-source Linux workloads with no Microsoft dependencies, AWS or Google Cloud may offer comparable pricing. The comparison isn't always one-sided. For a more detailed breakdown across all 3 major providers, Azure versus AWS versus Google Cloud, Best Pick for SMBs walks through pricing, support, and ecosystem fit for common SMB scenarios. The hidden costs of DIY cloud infrastructure versus managed Azure services. One of the most underappreciated questions for startups is whether to manage Azure infrastructure themselves or use a managed services provider. The upfront cost of DIY looks lower. The total cost often isn't. DIY cloud infrastructure carries several hidden costs that rarely appear in the initial budget. Engineering time: a typical SMB spends 15 to 25% of developer time on infrastructure management. At a loaded cost of $120 per hour for a developer, that's $50,000 to $80,000 per year in opportunity cost. Incident response: without 24/7 monitoring, outages during off hours go undetected. Each hour of downtime for an e-commerce site costs real revenue. Compliance gaps: SOC 2, HIPAA, and PCI DSS compliance require documented configurations and audit trails. DIY teams often discover these gaps during their first audit, at significant remediation cost. Suboptimal architecture: teams without deep Azure expertise tend to over-provision and under-optimize, which is exactly the 30 to 40% overspend pattern described at the start of this guide. Managed Azure services from a specialist provider typically cost 20 to 30% of the total infrastructure bill. But the combination of reduced overspend, faster incident response, and free developer time usually makes the economics favorable for businesses in the $1 million to $10 million ARR range. If you're planning a cloud migration to improve cost control, migrate on-premise infrastructure to Azure. No Downtime covers how to structure the transition without business disruption. How to calculate and control snapshot costs in Azure. Azure snapshot costs are one of the most common sources of bill creep for SMBs. Snapshots are incremental after the first, but if you're taking daily snapshots of large managed disks and never deleting them, costs accumulate fast. To calculate Azure snapshot costs, open the Azure pricing calculator and select Managed Disks. Select your storage tier: Premium SSD, Standard SSD, or Standard HDD. Enter the size of the source disk. Snapshot pricing is charged per GB of used storage, at the same rate as the underlying disk tier. For example, a 1 TB premium SSD disk with 500 GB of used data generates a snapshot costing roughly 6 cents x 500 equals $30 per month. Keep 30 daily snapshots and that's $900 per month for a single disk. Snapshot management best practices: set a retention policy. Azure Backup lets you define how long snapshots are kept before automatic deletion. 7 days of daily snapshots plus 4 weeks of weekly snapshots is a solid baseline for production databases. Use Azure Backup policies instead of ad hoc snapshots wherever possible. They enforce consistent retention and provide centralized management. Audit orphan snapshots quarterly. Run filtered by creation date to find snapshots older than 90 days. Review and delete those no longer tied to active workloads. Consider storage tiering for infrequently accessed snapshot data. Moving older snapshots to cool or archive tier reduces costs by 50 to 80%. How to reduce Azure cloud costs: an SMB optimization checklist. The most consistent approach to reduce cost in Azure cloud is to work through a structured checklist on a recurring schedule rather than making ad hoc changes. Here is a practical one for startups and SMBs under $5 million ARR. Monthly tasks. Review Azure cost management spend by resource group. Confirm all budget alerts are active and routed to the right recipients. Check Azure Advisor for new cost recommendations. Quarterly tasks. Run workload benchmarking on all production VMs and right size as needed. Audit snapshots and delete any exceeding your retention policy. Review reserved instance coverage. Add reservations for any VM running above 70% uptime. Shut down dev/test environments outside business hours using Azure Automation Runbooks. Check for unused public IP addresses, empty storage accounts, and orphan disks. Verify auto-scaling rules. Confirm scale-in is working correctly. Annual tasks. Reassess your RI commitments before renewal. Review Azure subscription structure. Consolidate redundant subscriptions. Benchmark your Azure costs against alternatives and update your architecture if the numbers justify it. Following this checklist consistently, most SMBs can hold Azure cloud spending at 60 to 70% of what they'd pay without any optimization. The Azure Cost Optimization for SMBs 10 Proven Ways Guide provides an expanded version of this checklist with step-by-step configuration instructions for each item. Conclusion. Learning how to reduce cost in Azure Cloud is an ongoing process rather than a one-time project. The 40% savings target is realistic, but it requires combining several strategies: reserved instances for predictable workloads, autoscaling for variable traffic, workload benchmarking to right-size resources, and consistent use of Azure's native cost management tools. Each approach produces meaningful savings on its own. Used together, they compound into a significantly lower monthly bill. The businesses that consistently spend less on Azure treat cost management as a recurring operational task, not an emergency response to a high invoice. Start with the quarterly checklist above, review your Azure Advisor recommendations this week, and identify your first reserved instance purchase candidate. If you want expert help implementing these strategies without pulling your development team off product work, our team specializes in bespoke Azure cost optimization for SMBs. Get in touch to schedule a free cloud cost review.